The smell of synthetic coffee and faint ozone lingered in the air of the Garrison 4 space station as Commander Jessa Harrow stood before the massive viewport, staring into the emptiness of space. For a moment, the silence of the station pressed in around her, an odd contrast to the constant hum of its life support systems. The hum was a reminder that things were never truly silent, never truly still. There was always something on the horizon, something that would need her attention. But not today. Today was supposed to be a moment of calm, an easy mission to scout out a nearby asteroid field for potential mining sites. At least, that was how it had been briefed. But here she stood, hands on her hips, watching a small fleet of transport ships cluster around the station like overenthusiastic flies. Another cargo run, another delay, she muttered under her breath. "Boss," came the voice of Lieutenant Drew Mason, her second in command. He was leaning against the doorway of her observation room, trying to hide a grin that barely managed to remain contained. He had the look of a man who had spent far too much time around the command center's chaos and was clearly finding amusement in it. Jessa turned to face him, one eyebrow arching. "What's got you smiling like that? Remember how you said the new cargo freighter crew would be a breath of fresh air?" Mason asked, his voice barely concealing the sarcasm. "Well, let's just say, fresh might not be the word I'd use." Jessa gave a resigned sigh and walked toward the observation window, squinting at the ever-growing cluster of transport ships. It wasn't the crew that worried her. New blood was always a good thing on a station that had seen as much turnover as Garrison 4. It was the sheer spectacle of it all. Half of these freighters had no business being here. They were old models, the kind of rust buckets that only made it to this side of the galaxy when there was nowhere else left for them to go. Yet here they were, clogging up the docks with no clear purpose, no apparent plan. "What's the problem?" Jessa asked, her hands now pressed flat against the cool glass. She could see the crew scrambling on the dock, a blur of frantic activity that had somehow become a regular occurrence. Mason paused, his grin fading into a more serious expression. "You might want to take a look for yourself, Commander." Jessa's boots clicked on the metal floor as she made her way toward the control panel, her fingers dancing across the touchscreen interface. With a swipe, the station's sensors zoomed in on the freighters. The largest of them, the Mistral, had a glaringly obvious issue. Its cargo ramp was stuck halfway down, its engine sputtering as if on the verge of giving out, and a trail of sparks shot out from its belly. Worse still, the station's main comms console showed that the crew was unable to communicate with the bridge. "Well, that's not good," she muttered. Mason was beside her now, his arms folded, his tone light but his eyes betraying the gravity of the situation. "Might want to call the repair team. Or, get creative." Jessa raised an eyebrow, unsure whether he was being flippant or serious. She was no stranger to crises. Running a deep space station came with its fair share of hazards, but this situation was different. They were a day's travel from any real help, and the Mistral wasn't the only one with issues. From the looks of it, the rest of the incoming freighters were having mechanical problems of their own. A malfunctioning fleet, all arriving at the same time, was no coincidence. Something was off. Jessa's fingers drummed against the edge of the console. There were two primary choices: call in the maintenance crew, or take matters into her own hands. Neither one would be particularly simple. The maintenance team was stretched thin as it was, and calling in a third-party repair crew would take hours, maybe even days, to arrive. Not exactly ideal for a fleet of potentially malfunctioning ships blocking the station's main docking bay. She made a decision. "Get me Captain Ramirez on the line," Jessa ordered. Ramirez was the head of the transport division and could likely provide insight into what was going wrong with the fleet. Mason nodded and tapped at the console. The screen flickered before showing the stern face of Captain Ramirez. A weathered woman in her late 40s, her salt and pepper hair pulled into a tight bun, Ramirez didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Commander, what can I do for you?" she asked, her tone brisk, but not unfriendly. "I need to know what's going on with the fleet," Jessa said, a note of frustration creeping into her voice. "You've got ships coming in with faulty equipment, and we're not set up for this kind of mess." What happened to the fleet being ready for the cargo run? Ramirez exhaled sharply, her expression hardening. We've had some complications. She paused, eyes darting momentarily as though calculating her next words. I'll be blunt, Commander. These ships were supposed to be checked by the techs back at New Terra before they were cleared for departure. It seems some of them were given a pass under questionable circumstances. The Mistral was supposed to be retrofitted last month, but some logistical issues prevented that. Logistical issues? What, they couldn't find the parts? Jessa snapped, her patience wearing thin. Ramirez winced, but her face remained composed. More like we were dealing with a minor rebellion in the Union that handles the retrofits. The fleet was overdue for departure, and the situation became urgent. I didn't get all the details, but when the Mistral left port, it was clear that it wasn't fully ready to go. We were hoping it would make it to Garrison 4 without too much trouble. I know it's not ideal, but it's the best I could do. The situation was becoming clearer, and yet no easier to resolve. Jessa's brow furrowed. These kinds of oversights were typical of bureaucratic mismanagement, but this was a critical moment. A series of malfunctioning ships on a space station so far from immediate help wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a disaster waiting to unfold. And the longer the ships stayed docked, the worse the situation would become. It would clog up the station's entire logistical network, delaying trade and putting everyone aboard the station at risk of fuel shortages, food rationing, and even more serious concerns. All right, Jessa said, taking a breath. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to meet you down at the docking bay with the maintenance crew. We'll start by assessing the Mistral. We need to get that ship off the dock as soon as possible, and we'll figure out the rest from there. Ramirez didn't hesitate. Understood, Commander. I'll get my team prepped and meet you there. Jessa hung up and turned to Mason. Grab the team, Drew. We'll need all hands on deck for this. I want to make sure everything goes smoothly, or at least, as smoothly as we can manage. Mason gave her a sharp nod, his grin returning. Don't worry, boss. This'll be fun. Like trying to fix a broken toaster in zero gravity. Jessa could feel her temples starting to throb as she turned back toward the viewport. The tension in her chest was building. She had known that the mission wouldn't be as simple as it seemed, but she hadn't expected this much of a mess. And she didn't like it. But she had her team, and she had the experience. They would fix this, one way or another. Her eyes flicked back toward the Mistral, its damaged engines now flashing a warning signal in the dark of space. There was no time to waste. If they didn't act quickly, this fleet could cripple the station. Jessa inhaled deeply, bracing herself for what was about to unfold. You said. The docking bay was chaotic, as expected. The Mistral was still hanging awkwardly in the airlock, its cargo ramp stuck halfway down, and the station's engineers were clustered around the massive freighter like a swarm of bees trying to figure out which way the hive had gone wrong. Sparks crackled and the occasional burst of steam hissed from the belly of the ship as Jessa stepped into the hangar, her boots clicking sharply against the metallic floor. Drew Mason was at her side, glancing around with an amused expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. The atmosphere was thick with frustration and confusion, the kind of environment that bred mistakes. She wasn't used to working under such pressure, but this station wasn't exactly new to her either. A few decades of space station life would prepare anyone for this kind of madness, but it didn't make it easier. Boss, Mason called out, pointing toward the docking bay doors. I think we've got company. Jessa followed his gaze to see a pair of freighters, identical in design, both ancient models with mismatched engines and dented hulls, drifting toward the station. They weren't maneuvering properly. In fact, they were barely moving at all. One of them seemed to be stuck in a slow, uncontrolled spin, its engine sputtering as it approached. The other, even worse, was heading straight for the station's outer perimeter without any sign of slowing down. This is not good, Jessa muttered. Before she could react, a voice crackled over the station's comms system. Garrison 4, this is the Sundown, requesting immediate docking clearance. We've got a massive fuel leak, systems are offline. Repeat, we need immediate assistance. The message was followed by the unmistakable sound of alarms and static. Jess's stomach churned. There were only a handful of freighters in the fleet, but one of them was already in trouble, and more were coming in with unknown issues. If the Sundown was leaking fuel, there was no telling how much more could go wrong. "Commander," came the voice of Chief Engineer Lila Torres over the comms. "We've got a problem. The Mistral's power grid is completely offline. The engines are dead, and the coolant systems are dangerously close to overheating. If we don't get it running soon, we're looking at a major thermal event." Jess's gaze snapped back to the Mistral, now barely hanging in place as its docking clamps struggled to hold the freighter steady. "Torres, find a way to keep the Mistral from cooking itself. We'll need to figure out what's causing the damage, but it's not going anywhere right now. Focus on the immediate danger." There was a beat of silence before Torres responded. "Understood. But if we don't get those engines working in the next 10 minutes, we won't have much of a station left to worry about." Jessa clenched her jaw. A thermal event meant a fuel fire, and a fire in the station's docking bay could easily turn into a catastrophic explosion. Garrison 4 wasn't built for that kind of disaster. The station had enough reserves to keep the crew alive in a worst-case scenario, but not a full-scale evacuation. "All right, Mason," Jessa said, her voice hard with resolve. "We're going to have to play it by ear. I want you to get the freighter crews organized and into teams, start with the Sundown. Get them out of that leaking fuel situation, and make sure they're safely docked." Mason gave her a nod, then darted off toward the Sundown, shouting orders to the scrambling crew. Jessa stood in the center of the chaos, trying to keep her thoughts in order. She had always excelled in situations like this, cool under pressure, a sharp strategist. But there was something about the way everything was spiraling out of control that made her feel like she was losing her grip. There was too much going wrong, too fast, and the stakes were only getting higher. She turned to the nearest maintenance officer, a young woman named Orla. "Get me a full status report on all incoming freighters," Jessa ordered, her voice clipped. "What's the damage on the other ships?" Orla quickly tapped at her pad. Well, the Windward has a damaged reactor casing. Nothing that'll blow it up, but it's leaking coolant, dangerous, but manageable. The Halcyon has a busted navigation system. It's floating aimlessly and needs manual control to dock. The others, well, it's the usual mix of engine failures and power grid problems. But the Sundown is the most critical right now." Jessa frowned, tapping her fingers against her thigh. "Okay. Let's start with the basics, get the Halcyon docked first. It's less risky than anything else. Once we get that under control, we can focus on the other ships." Orla nodded and hurried off to relay the orders, leaving Jessa standing there, her mind racing. There was too much to handle at once, but she was used to this. No one expected smooth sailing in deep space. Garrison 4 wasn't just a stop for cargo, it was a lifeline. A place where many ships came to rest, where crews took respite, and where survival often depended on quick thinking and teamwork. Jessa glanced back at the Mistral, which was still clinging to the docking clamps. Her breath caught for a moment when she noticed a flash of light along the hull, a warning beacon. The freighter was in worse shape than they'd initially realized. She had to act quickly. She tapped her communicator. "Torres, what's the latest on the Mistral? We can't afford to wait much longer." The engineer's voice crackled back through the comms. "I'm doing everything I can, Commander, but the thermal stabilizers are fried. I've got a team trying to reroute the power, but it's a patch job at best. If the system doesn't stabilize soon, we'll have to cut power completely." Jessa hesitated for a moment, then made her decision. "Do it. Cut the power. We're not going to risk an explosion for the sake of a few systems. We need time to fix the bigger issues." "Understood. Stand by." Jessa turned back to the station's command console, her eyes scanning the chaos unfolding in the docking bay. Her mind raced as she pieced together a plan. The Sundown was a priority, but so was the rest of the fleet. One wrong move, one misstep, and Garrison 4 could be looking at an unprecedented disaster. "Orla," she called, waving the maintenance officer back over. "Get me the control codes for the Windward's coolant system. We need to shut it down until we can stabilize the reactor. I'll take the rest of the ships from here." Orla nodded quickly, tapping commands into her pad. "I'll get those right away, Commander." As Jessa turned back toward the Mistral, the docking bay alarms blared again. This time, it wasn't a routine warning, it was a full emergency alert. The Sundown had breached its docking clamps and was drifting dangerously toward the hangar's outer wall. No time for second-guessing, Jessa muttered to herself. Without a moment's hesitation, she sprinted toward the nearest emergency response team, issuing quick, sharp commands. "Get that freighter stabilized. Now." The team sprang into action, some moving toward the Sundown while others hurried to check the other ships in the fleet. The tension in the air was palpable, each moment stretching out into what felt like eternity. As she watched the freighters drift and spin in their precarious positions, Jessa realized something: she was no longer merely reacting to the situation. She was driving it. She was thinking ahead, adapting on the fly, and making decisions that, though risky, were her only option in a desperate race against time. And for the first time in hours, Jessa felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could make it through this. The seconds stretched into eternity as the comms blared in a chaotic mix of urgent updates, warnings, and commands. Jessa stood at the heart of Garrison 4's chaos, her eyes darting between the flickering hollow interfaces and the tangled mess of freighters in the docking bay. The temperature had risen several degrees in the past few minutes, and the heavy pressure of urgency weighed on her like a physical force. Each move felt like it carried the risk of tipping the entire station over the edge. "Commander, we're running out of time," Torres's voice crackled through the comms. "The Mistral's hull is heating up faster than we can cool it down. If we don't get those stabilizers online, we'll lose the entire ship." Jessa's fingers tightened on the edge of the console as she mentally weighed the decision. Torres was right. Without stabilizers, the Mistral would be too unstable to stay in the docking bay. It could drift, causing more chaos, or worse, take out other ships in the process. But with the other freighters in various states of disrepair, they didn't have the resources to throw everything at just one ship. "All right," Jessa said, her voice sharp with command. "Cut the coolant lines to the Windward, we'll manage the reactor shutdown manually. Then get everything you've got on the Mistral." Torres's response was immediate, but there was a sharp edge of frustration to her voice. "You're asking us to pull parts from the backup systems to fix the primary systems on a ship that's about to go critical? That's not a repair, Commander. That's a gamble." Jessa's grip on the console tightened further. She hated gambling with people's lives. But right now, it was the only card she had left to play. "You've got 10 minutes, she snapped, cutting the comms. "We make this work, or we're going to be cleaning up the aftermath." The station's central control room was filled with the hum of activity. Crew members darted around in every direction, following her orders with the precision of well-trained soldiers. Jessa could see the faces of the engineers as they worked, their expressions tight with the same tension that gripped her. They were all aware that the risk was too great, but Jessa had never known anyone to back down when she asked for their help. She turned to Mason, who was overseeing the stabilizing efforts on the Sundown. The freighter had been successfully docked, but it wasn't out of danger yet. Sparks flew as the crew worked quickly to patch the hull, sealing off the fuel leak and rerouting power from the Sundown's own backup generators to keep the life support systems running. "We're running out of time, Drew," Jessa said, meeting Mason's eyes. His usually laid-back demeanor had turned to stone, and she could tell he was feeling the weight of the situation as much as she was. "We'll get it done," Mason replied. His voice was steady, but there was an edge of uncertainty beneath the surface. Jessa was starting to feel the exhaustion settle in, but there was no time to rest. She moved swiftly across the hangar bay, barking orders as she went, ensuring that the other freighters were secured and their problems contained. As she passed by, a technician stopped her, holding up a datapad. "Commander, I've got something that might help," the technician said, breathless from the frantic pace. "We've been rerouting power from the windward systems to try and keep the reactors from overloading. But the main issue isn't just the coolant failure. It's the stabilization field. If we could reinforce it with the Mistral's spare parts, we could get the power grid back online, at least temporarily." Jessa's heart skipped a beat. She had already written off the possibility of using spare parts from the Mistral. The ship was far too far gone. But the technician's suggestion had merit. If they could stabilize the windward long enough to get the reactors under control, it might buy them the time they needed to focus on the Mistral. "Get the team on it," Jessa ordered. "Fast. We need to act now, or we won't have any options left." The technician nodded and sprinted off to relay the orders, leaving Jessa to continue coordinating. Her mind was working at full capacity now, her focus narrow as the clock ticked down. But just as she thought she might have gained a little ground, the station's alarm shrieked once more, and the emergency lights flickered to life, casting everything in an eerie red glow. "Commander!" Mason's voice rang out through the chaos. "You need to see this." Jessa's pulse quickened, and she raced toward the control panel where Mason was standing, his face pale as he stared at the main screen. The Sundown had been properly docked and was no longer a threat, but the same couldn't be said for the other freighters. The Halcyon had finally managed to dock, but there was a new problem. An explosion had ripped through its power core, and now the entire ship was drifting without power. It was headed straight toward the station's outer perimeter, and there was nothing in its path to stop it. Worse, the explosion had damaged the station's external shield grid, creating a small but growing gap in the defenses. "Is this happening?" Jessa asked herself aloud, her eyes wide with disbelief. The series of misfortunes was beginning to feel like a curse. Mason, never one to show fear, looked grim. "It's real. And the gap in the shields is growing. If that ship gets too close—" "I know," Jessa interrupted, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. "If that ship hits the perimeter, it'll breach the station. Everyone on board will be dead." There was no more time for hesitation. "Gather every available engineer. We're going to need to reinforce the shield grid immediately. Get a team on the Halcyon and start repairs. If we can't stop that ship, we're done for. I want every crew member on standby in the event we need to initiate a full evacuation. And Drew, I need you to oversee the freighter evacuation. Now." Mason nodded sharply, his earlier amusement gone. "Understood. On it." Jessa moved quickly to the command center, her heart hammering in her chest. There were only minutes left before the Halcyon breached the station's perimeter. Every second counted. As she entered the central control room, her eyes locked onto the array of holographic displays that showed the status of the station's failing shield grid. There was a flicker of hope when one of the engineers shouted out, "We've got the repair team working on the gap now, Commander. It'll take a few more minutes, but we're holding it together. The Halcyon is still on course to hit, though." Jessa's mind raced. She was about to make a decision that could mean the difference between life and death. Redirect all remaining power to the shield grid. "We don't have time to think, just do it. Whatever we need, we're making it work. Now." The engineer hesitated, then nodded, his hands moving quickly over the controls. The air in the room felt thick with anticipation. With every passing second, Jessa's thoughts raced faster than her heart could beat. They had to stop that ship. They had to stabilize the shields. They had to find a way to keep Garrison 4 intact. And then, just as the final warning alarms began blaring, the Halcyon came to a dead stop, its drifting momentum halted inches from the station's hull. The shields had held. But that wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. As Jessa let out the breath she had been holding, the voice of Chief Engineer Torres broke through the silence. "Commander, the Mistral's engines are back online. The stabilizers are holding steady." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jessa allowed herself a moment to breathe. They had done it. But only just. We're not out of the woods yet, she said to no one in particular, turning to face the control room's viewport. But for now, the station had survived. And they had learned a powerful lesson. The echoes of the chaos had started to fade, replaced by the steady hum of Garrison 4's systems as they returned to their normal rhythm. The docking bay was still a mess, equipment and crew still bustling under the strain of repairs, but the most urgent crises had been averted. The Mistral's engines were stable, the Sundown's fuel leak had been sealed, and the Halcyon had been successfully anchored just in time, its hull now barely kissing the station's outer walls. The situation was still critical in many areas, but there was hope. Jessa leaned back in her chair in the command room, letting out a long, exhausted breath. Her fingers hovered over the console, gliding across its surface as she updated the status logs. "Commander," came Torres's voice through the comms, a note of exhaustion in her tone. "We've got the reactors on the windward running again. But there's a lot of damage. It'll be a while before we can fully restore power." Jessa nodded, though Torres couldn't see the gesture. "Take the time you need. No more gambles. Keep it slow and steady." "I'll let you know if anything changes," Torres replied. Jessa paused, her fingers still resting over the console. She'd done everything she could to keep Garrison 4 intact, but she knew this wasn't a simple recovery. They'd all been pushed to their limits, and the true cost of their survival would only become clear in the coming days. A soft tap on her shoulder made her look up. Drew Mason stood in the doorway, his usual easygoing expression replaced with a weariness that mirrored her own. His eyes were tired, but there was an undeniable glint of satisfaction behind them. "How's the fleet?" Jessa asked, her voice low, tired but not defeated. Mason ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head. "Most of the ships are stable now. The Sundown is patched up, and the Mistral's engines are good. We'll need a few more days to make sure everything's secure, but we've done the impossible, Commander." Her lips curved into a wry smile. "Not the first time." "No," Mason said with a grin. "But probably the closest we've come to not making it." Jessa met his gaze, and for a moment, the weight of their shared experience settled between them. In this line of work, survival wasn't a given. It never was. But they had come out on the other side of the crisis, scarred but alive, and that meant something. It was a reminder that sometimes, the most important lessons weren't the ones taught by manuals or protocol, but by fire, by the stakes of real life. "Well," Jessa said after a long pause, pushing herself to her feet. "We've got some downtime now. Let's make sure we actually use it." Mason raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" "Meaning we fix what needs fixing, we rebuild what got broken, and we make sure everyone's caught up on the training they missed while they were busy almost dying." Mason laughed softly. "Good idea. Maybe we should also put together a how-to guide for surviving every disaster the universe can throw at us." "Maybe," Jessa said, a rare chuckle escaping her as she moved past him toward the command center's viewport. She looked out at the station's wide expanse, her eyes taking in the view of the distant stars and the slowly rotating ships in the docking bay. They had averted catastrophe, but the scars were there, even if they weren't visible. Every crew member, every technician, every officer had come together in ways she hadn't expected. The moments of tension, of absolute uncertainty, had proven one thing: Garrison 4 was more than just a station. It was a community. "That wasn't easy," Jessa murmured, almost to herself. Mason leaned against the console beside her. "No, but we did it. And the people here are stronger for it. We've been tested, some of us more than others, but we came through. We've learned something, too," Jessa said, her voice quiet but steady. "Maybe it's not about knowing exactly what to do in a crisis. Maybe it's about knowing how to adapt. And more than anything, knowing that when we stick together, we'll find a way." Mason was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "You're right." Jessa looked at him. "You okay, Drew?" He shrugged, but there was something softer in his eyes now. "Yeah. Just, remembering all the close calls. But I think we came out stronger." "I know I did." Jessa studied him for a long moment. Mason had always been her rock, steady, reliable. But the way he carried himself now told her something had shifted inside of him, just as it had within her. The stress of the last 24 hours had stripped away any illusions about their immortality in the vastness of space. They had nearly lost everything. But they had survived. "Well," Jessa said, breaking the silence, her voice light, "if you're done with the self-reflection, I've got a few more reports to file." Mason snorted, the tension easing from his shoulders. "I thought you were going to take a break. You're a workaholic, you know that?" She shot him a sidelong glance. "You don't stay alive in this job by taking breaks. Besides, there's still a lot of work to do." Mason shook his head, grinning. "Fair enough, Commander. But I think I'll take a nap. Can't do any work if I fall asleep on the console, right?" Jessa chuckled. "Go ahead. Take all the rest you need. We've earned it." But as Mason walked off to catch some much-needed sleep, Jessa's gaze lingered on the stars outside. The ship traffic had settled for the time being, the station was under control, and for once, she could allow herself a breath of relief. A part of her knew that it wouldn't be long before the next crisis arrived. Space was unpredictable, and Garrison 4 had always drawn trouble. But she also knew one thing now: no matter what came next, they would face it together. No one would face it alone. And that was the greatest lesson of all. In the midst of the uncertainty, in the never-ending void of space, the one thing that could hold a crew together, that could hold a station together, was the strength they found in each other. "Yeah," Jessa murmured to herself, as a smile crept onto her face. "We're ready for whatever comes next." The soft hum of the station surrounded her as she stood there, staring out into the infinite expanse, knowing they had all built something far greater than the station's walls. They had built a family, a community, and, against all odds, a legacy. And that would carry them through, no matter how many more challenges the universe threw their way. With that thought, Jessa finally allowed herself a deep breath, feeling the weight of the last day's trials settle into something far lighter. She had learned everything she needed to know. And it was enough.